I was always the one they forgot to mention. At birthdays, I got the, "Oh, right, you're here, look." At dinner, my seat was near the edge, closer to the kitchen than the conversation. When people asked how many children were in the Hart family, Diana would smile politely and say, "Just Josh." Sometimes she caught herself and added, "And Evelyn too, of course," like she'd remembered a distant cousin at the last second. No one ever asked me what I was doing with my life. Maybe because they already decided I wasn't doing anything worth talking about. There was a day when my own father, at a table filled with relatives and glazed ham, looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're not going to make it, Evelyn. This whole military thing, it's running away, not growing up. You're failing." He meant it like a fact, not an insult. The others just chewed in silence. I left home when I was 17 without ceremony, without hugs. No one stopped me. The door closed behind me with a soft click, the kind that sounds more like relief than grief. Years passed. I didn't send photos, they didn't ask. And that was fine until last fall, when the Hart family found themselves in the middle of a disaster zone on the other side of the world. Buildings collapsed. Volunteers missing. One of them was Josh, my half-brother, the golden boy. That's when the phone rang. And that's when the man on the other end said, "General Hart, we need you on site. Now." Suddenly, the girl they forgot to count at family dinners had stars on her collar. Suddenly, the disappointment of the family was in command of the operation to bring their son home alive. They didn't know yet. Not until I stepped off that chopper in uniform boots, touching down beside the wreckage, and a medic turned to the others and said, "Mom's here. The general just arrived." Silence. Complete, stunned silence. But before that moment, before the salutes and headlines and shocked eyes, there were years of being erased, forgotten, dismissed. There was a long road that started in a dining room with a forkful of silence and a father who wouldn't look me in the eye. And that's where my story really begins. The letter came on a grey Wednesday afternoon, unremarkable, like most things involving my family. It arrived tucked between base reports and logistics memos sealed in cream envelope paper with the Hart family crest. I hadn't seen that crest in years, not since the last time I sent a Christmas card home, and it was returned unopened. Inside, a folded piece of thick stationery. Just one line. "Farewell gathering for Josh Turner." No salutation, no mention of me, no invitation, just a date, a time, an address home. I sat with it for a long time, turned it over, studied the embossed letters like they might whisper some kind of hidden meaning. They didn't. It wasn't for me. It never was. Josh Turner, my half-brother. The golden boy, the one they raised right. Son of Diana, my stepmother who married my father when I was 10 and gave birth to Josh a year later. She moved into our house, wearing perfume that stung like warning, rearranged every photo, every cupboard, and every routine until even my bedtime story disappeared. I became a background character in my own childhood. Diana had a way of looking at me like I was a scratch on the surface of her perfect mirror, something she didn't cause but resented having to see every day. My father, Michael Hart, was a professor of sociology, ironic considering how little he understood people. He was the kind of man who hated confrontation more than he loved his own daughter, and so he let Diana shape the house, let her shape Josh, let her erase me in small, polite ways. Still, I went, not for them, for something quieter inside me. Not revenge, not pride, just curiosity maybe. Part of me wanted to see if I still disappeared in their eyes, or if time had made them blink. I wore jeans, boots, a plain navy sweater, hair pulled back, no insignia, no medals, no trace of rank. Just Evelyn. As they remembered her, the girl who left at 18 and never looked back. The driveway looked smaller, or maybe I had outgrown it. The house hadn't changed, still the same white shutters, still the same hedges trimmed into anxious perfection. I rang the bell. Diana opened the door. For a moment, her smile froze like she'd seen a ghost she couldn't quite place. Her platinum hair was pulled back tight as ever, makeup flawless, posture sharp like always. She stepped aside without greeting. "You came," she said flatly. Not surprise, not welcome, just an obligation, like a line she'd practiced but didn't mean. Diana never liked mess. And to her, I was always a complication, an old photo left in the wrong frame. Josh, on the other hand, was the masterpiece, raised on applause, framed in expectation. He had Diana's ambition, Michael's name, and none of my burden. The living room was filled with noise, toasts and folding chairs, catered sandwiches, and people who hadn't spoken my name in over a decade. My father stood in the corner, looking down into his cup like the punch had answers. When he saw me, his eyes flicked away so fast it hurt more than if he'd glared. I slipped into a seat near the back, next to a houseplant that had outlived most of our family traditions. A cousin looked over and whispered to someone. I didn't catch the words, but I knew the tone, sharp curiosity cut with judgment. Someone asked where I'd come from. I opened my mouth, but before I could answer, Diana stepped in. "She's just visiting. Works. Somewhere overseas. Logistics, I think." She waved her hand like brushing off lint. I didn't correct her. I'd learned long ago that truth meant little in rooms that preferred fiction. Josh stood up for a short speech. He was 19 now. Tall, polished, his smile practiced. He talked about service, about stepping into responsibility. "It's time I do something meaningful," he said. "Something that matters." The room clapped politely. Diana beamed. My father nodded. I clapped too once. Late. No one asked me to speak. No one said, "It's good to see you." I could have been a stranger who wandered in from the sidewalk. Still, I stayed. Let the chatter swirl around me like a life I was never invited to. And when the laughter faded into background noise and the plates began to empty, I stood. Walked slowly to the door, my hand brushing the banister one last time. No one followed. No one even turned. Before I stepped out, I paused at the threshold. Wrote the words silently to myself like a quiet vow. They don't know who I've become, but they're about to find out. I drove away thinking about how my life unraveled the night I left that house for good. At 10, the last time I felt real at the dinner table was the night we celebrated my mother's birthday before she died. After that, everything started shifting. A woman named Diana moved in polished. The floors changed the curtains and slowly replaced the warmth with frost. I was 11 when Josh turned 1. A brother I didn't choose, born in a home that once belonged to me. When I was 12, I remember watching from the hallway as Diana pinched baby Josh's cheeks, cooing about how he'd make a fine lawyer or doctor, someone respectable. Meanwhile, I stood there, with scraped knees and cracked books, volunteering for after-school programs and helping neighbours. I thought the world would notice. But they only noticed what fit the picture Diana painted. By 14, I had learned to be quiet. I earned straight A's, but they were invisibilised as just being smart. I rescued kittens, but those too were forgotten after dinner. I still remember the science fair when I was 12. I spent weeks building a solar water purifier. It worked perfectly. My teacher said it was college-level thinking. I came home so proud, certificate in hand, hoping someone would notice. Diana glanced at it and said, "You should have asked Josh to help next time. It would look more collaborative." Josh was 4. That night, the certificate ended up behind a grocery list on the fridge, never to be mentioned again. I thought, maybe if I did something big, something that couldn't be ignored, it would finally earn a place on the fridge. I tried to tell my father how I wanted to enlist one day, to serve, to feel connected to something bigger, but he looked at the dinner plate and changed the subject. He didn't see ambition in my eyes. He saw rebellion. And rebellion to him was never loud, it was simply anything that didn't follow the blueprint he trusted. My father had this calm way of invalidating dreams. When I told him I liked astronomy, he said stars are nice, but why not something more practical? When I made the track team, he warned me not to get too bulky. Boys don't like girls with strong arms. And when I asked if I could join a school trip to a national park, he muttered something about those outdoor programs being too wild for girls. He never shouted, never slammed doors. But over time, he rewrote what was possible for me without ever raising his voice. At 16, I started running before dawn, lifting weights heavier than my backpack, preparing in secret for the military. I remembered the sting when Diana found my boot camp pamphlets hidden in my drawer. I watched her smile at Josh's soccer flyer later that night. No mention of me. The question always hung in the air. Why couldn't I be more like him? That all changed on my 17th birthday dinner. Candles on the table, faces around it, the scent of lemon herb chicken in the air. I tried. I said, I've decided after graduation I'm enlisting. Silence. The fork paused halfway to my mouth. My father's eyes lifted like he needed something to anchor on. He said nothing for so long I thought I'd imagined the moment. Then Diana cleared her throat. Evelyn, darling, that's bold, but don't you think you owe it to yourself to get a degree? A safer path, something less, well, dangerous. She smiled, but her eyes tightened. Josh looked at me confused. He was 17, old enough to know what was happening, but too young to challenge it. My father spoke then, his tone careful. You're running away from responsibility, he said. Chasing uniforms because you can't handle real life. A woman's job isn't to lead armies. It's to find stability, maybe take an office job, marry well. That night, my world tilted. I packed a duffel bag after they fell asleep. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. Their silence was my permission. At 18, I left home. The letter I left behind still unwritten wouldn't have changed the outcome. I signed up, graduated boot camp, deployed overseas, and with each mission I carried their doubt with me like weight. It became my fuel. The military was brutal, demanding, unforgiving, but honest. It didn't care who I was to my family, it measured what I could do. Deployment followed deployment. My name appeared in classified reports, debriefings not in newspapers. Diplomats thanked me quietly. Commanders praised me quietly. But at home, I became a rumour I heard she's in some secret unit, or I saw a photo online once. Nothing more. Nothing concrete. By 25, I was a sergeant. At 30, I was a lieutenant. No letters came from home, no postcards, nothing. My father told campus friends my daughter did something admirable, I guess. His voice trailed off in that old library foyer, the silence louder than any apology. When I was 33, I became captain. Diana's life was documented in charity brochures and social events. Josh was finishing college. They were achieving together while I became a ghost. But the military didn't ghost me. They promoted me, trained me, tested me. I became a Green Beret, a leader, a woman who had eyes on operations, but none on the applause. I found my voice in the field, not the living room. I think now, when I enter that gathering, this is part of that story. It's the story of a girl who grew into a general, but it's also the story of silence that shaped her. Tonight might be the first time they see what I became after I left. Or maybe they'll still see nothing. Either way, I'm done disappearing. But before I became a name stitched into uniforms and whispered through comms under fire, I was just another recruit in line at a base camp in the middle of nowhere, with boots too stiff and a silence packed tighter than my duffel. I was 18 when I walked into basic training. No farewell, no send-off, just a one-way ticket and a pair of dog tags waiting at the other end. The army didn't ask about my past. It didn't care about dinner table silences or the shape of my stepmother's disappointment. It cared if I could run, shoot, follow orders, lead. And I could. Boot camp was brutal, but at least it was honest. Sweat replaced longing. Pain made room for focus. I learned quickly how to take up space in a place that had no room for excuses. While others wrote home, I trained harder. While others read letters from loved ones, I read manuals. And when mail call came, I already knew my name wouldn't be called. They had erased me long before I left. Graduation day was a storm of handshakes and cheering families, flags and cameras. I stood on the parade ground in full uniform, sharp as any of them, maybe sharper. My name was announced. My CO gave me a nod. I scanned the crowd out of instinct, though I knew better. No Michael, no Diana, no familiar face searching for mine. I was a ghost before I even earned the title. Still, I moved forward. I got deployed. I saw places most people can't pronounce, let alone survive in. I patched wounds under fire, negotiated in dialects I picked up in field hospitals and market stalls. There were nights I slept upright against Humvees, and mornings I woke to mortar fire like it was an alarm clock. No one called, no one asked. I sent letters. At first, I sent one after my first successful operation, another when I made sergeant. They came back unopened. Diana's handwriting across the envelope. Return to sender, no recipient at this address. That address had been mine once. My room was probably a guest room now. When I made lieutenant, the announcement was published in a small corner of a military bulletin. I sent a copy home not to brag, just to share. Weeks later, I heard from a cousin that my father had said something like, "She's doing something abroad, not sure what exactly." They didn't care what I did, just that I wasn't doing it in a way that fit their mould. I wasn't the smiling daughter with a degree from Yale and a husband in finance. I wasn't the kind of story they told at charity dinners. I was an inconvenience, a quiet contradiction to their version of family. But the military saw me. It saw every ounce of grit I put in, every call I made under pressure, every soldier I pulled through when they wanted to quit. And it promoted me, not because I asked, but because I delivered. I became Captain Ha at 29, then Major, then eventually General. Each new title came without a phone call home. I stopped sending updates. They weren't listening, they never had. I remember once being featured in a defence segment, a blurry image of me helping evacuees during a flood op. A friend told me it aired briefly on cable. I wondered if Michael had watched it. If Diana had recognised the figure behind the rescue gear. Probably not, because to them, I was still that 17-year-old girl at the end of a dinner table fork, hovering mid-air telling them she was enlisting. That night had felt like stepping off a cliff. I remember the tension thick like oil in the air. Candlelight flickering against wine glasses. Diana blinking rapidly, her smile frozen like a hostess realising the party had been hijacked. Josh had just turned 17 too. He blinked, confused, unsure whose side he was supposed to be on. Michael's fork hit the plate too hard. "You're running away," he said, not raising his voice but slicing through mine. "You think this is strength? Signing up for a man's war. You can't even commit to college applications." I tried to speak, but he kept going. "You want to wear boots and shout orders? That's not a life. That's fantasy. A woman's job is to build peace, not chase war." He said it like a curse, like ambition was something ugly in girls. I looked at Diana then. She smoothed the napkin on her lap, didn't meet my eyes. "It's a phase," she murmured. "She'll grow out of it." No one argued. No one asked why I wanted it, or what I had already endured just to dream of it. That night, I packed silently. A duffel bag, some savings. The The boot camp flyer I kept folded inside an old novel. I left before dawn with only the porch light marking my exit. No one stopped me. No one called after. I became a soldier, alone, but not broken. I never looked back. Until now. Standing there in the Hart living room all these years later, I realised something. They still didn't see me. Not really, but that was about to change. Because I didn't just survive the path they warned me against. I owned it. I led it. And soon they would learn what the world already knew. General Hart wasn't a rumour. She was real. And she was home. The illusion of distance lasted about 24 hours. I had barely unpacked my overnight bag when the first message came through a briefing from command. A 7.8 magnitude earthquake had just hit South America, toppling buildings, displacing thousands, and compromising local rescue operations. The region was unstable landslides, aftershocks, collapsing bridges. Multiple NGOs and foreign aid workers were in the vicinity, several unaccounted for. I was briefed to prepare for deployment within the next 18 hours. I knew the drill. I'd led response missions before floods, fires, conflict zones where diplomacy and danger overlapped. But there was something different about the way my aide-de-camp walked into my temporary quarters, tablet in hand, eyes uncertain. "General," she said, tapping the screen, "we have a partial list of missing civilians near Sector 9. One name stood out." She handed me the tablet. The name blinked back in black and white: Josh Turner. My lungs stopped, then restarted. A flicker of heat moved down my spine, not panic, more like memory crystallized in adrenaline. I hadn't heard his name in an official capacity ever, not once. Just Josh, the boy who played with his food at dinner. The teenager who smirked when I said I wanted to join the military. The almost man who said nothing when I left. Now he was listed among the missing. "I need to lead the team," I said. "Mom, given your connection, it's not a request," I replied. That night, I barely slept. I sat with Josh's name glowing from the screen, playing over years of silence, and one call that ended with Josh's applying to Yale. That was the last time I heard his name. Now, it might be the last time I'd see it. I ran simulations, reviewed satellite data, cross-referenced terrain collapse models with heat signal scans. At 0400 hours, I issued orders to deploy. By 0900, I was airborne. In the chopper, I looked out the window at the vast green stretching below, now fractured by landslides and smoke. Josh was out there somewhere, a civilian volunteer caught in the chaos. I didn't know why he came to this part of the world. Maybe chasing purpose. Maybe running from something. That part didn't matter anymore. I'd seen civilians collapse under pressure. I'd seen stronger men than him freeze when faced with survival. But I wasn't going in as his sister. I was going in as a leader with 20 soldiers at my back and hundreds depending on our success. Still, the ache in my chest didn't go away. When we landed at base camp, the heat was suffocating. Relief tents flapped in the wind and the smell of dust and diesel filled the air. I met with the lead engineers, cross-checked terrain damage, and zeroed in on one collapsed community centre, where 2 aid workers were last pinged on comms. One of them matched Josh's volunteer ID. The local team hesitated, the ground still shifting, they warned. Going in might compromise more lives than it saves. I weighed their words. Then I looked at the map again. If I had waited during any other op, people would have died. Hesitation wasn't a luxury I'd earned. I turned to my team. "We move at 1300. Gear up." My second-in-command nodded. "You think he's still alive?" I didn't answer. Hope was private. But my voice came out clear. "I think someone out there still needs us." That's reason enough. For years, I had accepted being unseen. Ignored. But that day, in the thick of dust and risk, I would be the one calling shots, not as a sister, not as a daughter, but as a general. And if fate had decided to tie my past and my mission together in one fragile thread of survival, I was ready to walk that line. Even if no one ever knew. Even if Josh never realized who pulled him from the rubble. Because some truths aren't shouted. They're earned in silence, in sweat, in service. This time, the world wouldn't need to read about General Hart in footnotes. She was leading the charge. Heavy boots hit broken concrete as we disembarked from the Black Hawk into the chaos below. The damaged remains of Sector 9 lay around us, crumbling walls, scorched debris, fractured earth. Smoke drifted in the afternoon light, carrying the smell of dust and desperation. My team set up a perimeter tension humming in the air. Everyone knew what was at stake, not just refugee lives, but the life of someone I loved. I issued orders medics forward, engineers shoring support, search units grid sweep. My voice felt calm in the walkie-talkie, precise, authoritative. Inside, my chest clenched. This wasn't just another disaster. It was the bridge between who I'd been and what they needed me to be, now a general with a mission that overlapped family. At 1300, scanners alerted multiple heat signatures under collapsed concrete. 4 clusters. CCTV from an NGO camera showed bodies under rubble, one wearing a pale yellow vest, identical to those on the volunteer manifest. I swallowed, straightened my back, and moved with purpose. We breached through a partially intact wall. The structure groaned as beams shifted overhead. I led with my hand on the demolition charge. Engineers laid breaker charges to open a passage. As they drilled, I stayed alert, scanning, calculating, listening. This was rescue calculus: speed versus safety. Delay could kill. Haste could collapse structure further. The weight of responsibility pressed on me like lead. Finally, a hole wide enough to reach in. We crawled through. Inside, grit-covered bodies, moans muffled by dust. I found one volunteer pinned beneath a concrete slab. His ID badge, Josh Turner. Fear surged. It was him. I dropped next to him. "Volunteer Turner," I asked softly. He responded with a groan, muffled faint. His pulse fluttered under my fingers, wounds to his thigh, shallow abrasions on his cheek. I called for medics and arranged a makeshift strap to hoist him out. Halfway through extraction, the wall trembled, another aftershock. Shouting, I pushed my team back and braced the slab. "Hold steady." The shift paused. We kept moving. Once clear, Josh lay on a stretcher, unconscious but alive. Medics pumped adrenaline-administered fluids, packed him for medevac. I pressed my hand on his shoulder. I spoke to him, though I knew he might never hear the words. "I've got you. You're not alone." I stepped back, headset on. "Command casualty," Turner extracted. "Preparing evac. Site secure." They replied with static and clearance. I breathed. The moment passed. Around me, rescuers paused. Some realised who I was. A younger officer touched his collar. "General Hart, sir." I nodded, honour in his voice. I acknowledged with carry on. We moved away from the site. Josh was secure, airlifted within the hour. I watched the bird lift off, carrying him away conscious. Or not, he was moving towards life. I felt no relief, just resolve. I had proven this mission right and personal could coexist. You don't abandon family. You lead them through crisis. That night in the command tent, reports streamed from media in distant places. Photographs of the extraction surfaced, central image me dust-streaked, carrying a fragile figure on my shoulder. The press called it a miracle extraction. I didn't watch. I just filed orders, debriefed teams, closed grids. Later, I broke protocol and sent a short message to Diana's number. Josh is evacuated and stable. No flourish, no emotion, just fact. My team wouldn't know what it meant. But I did. I slept in my bunk that night, earplugs, minimal gear, always ready. My mind replayed the rescue. The blur, the dust, his limp weight. A brother I'd never been allowed to protect. Until now. Not as hidden kin, but as leader, as savior, as someone who refused to be erased. In the early hours, I drafted the after-action report. I wrote it in full detail: terrain response coordination, victim ID emotional impact. I included one line for the record rescue, performed under direct command of General Evelyn Hart. Everything else was protocol. Truth documented. Morning came. A new wave of aftershocks rattled tents. I briefed local authorities' shared resources. I walked through survivor camps, saw fresh wounds and weary eyes. A woman reached out and touched my sleeve. Thank you, General. She didn't know my story, but in that moment, I belonged to more than one world. I belonged to humanity. Then came a message from home. They'd landed in the capital, ready to see Josh. They didn't know I was here. They still thought I was elsewhere. I had to decide: stay leading rescue efforts or go meet them. I chose both. My team stayed strong. I would move on once I checked on Josh, but first I lingered. I walked back to the site at dawn. The wreckage lay silent. A cross hung from a broken beam. Someone placed it the night before. I laid my hand on splintered wood and whispered, "I'm here." This wasn't about reconciliation with them, it was affirmation of myself. I told the winds above, "You see me now." And I believed it. The descent into Sector 9 felt like entering a scar the Earth hadn't yet finished bleeding from. As the transport's rear gate dropped a gust of heat, and dust slammed into us, remnants of collapsed structures, burning fuel, and the unmistakable scent of fear. Debris stretched for miles, jagged concrete and twisted steel, forming grotesque silhouettes in the dim, smoke-filtered light. We landed near a provisional forward operations base, little more than tents hastily thrown up medbays, and a radio tower sagging like a tired sentinel. Aid workers in torn vests moved like ghosts. Children sat in circles, silent, some covered in ash. We'd seen it before, but it never felt less brutal. I stepped out first, flanked by my XO Captain Reed. He looked at me, awaiting orders. Coordinate with local command. I want search routes, casualty zones, potential structural collapse data. Every 30 minutes, no gaps. He saluted and disappeared into the haze. The ground wasn't stable. My boots sunk half an inch with each step. Beneath us, the earth still breathed and buckled. Somewhere under all this ruin, my brother. My brother, who had never sent a letter, never called, never reached out. Josh. But that didn't matter now. In this moment, he was just another name among the missing. And I was General Hart. My job was to bring people home. General, came a voice from the comms tent. A young technician, barely 20, holding a tablet like it had bitten him. We picked up a beacon ping. Civilian volunteer ID Josh Turner. I walked over slowly, eyes fixed on the screen. There, it was a weak signal from the Northwest Quadrant Grid 27C. My lungs clenched, then expanded. Relay coordinates to Alpha Squad. Ready my gear. The tech hesitated. Mum, Turner, is he... family? I looked him square in the eyes. He's a civilian, and civilians don't get left behind. He nodded and returned to his console. I turned away before he could see anything else in my face. No one needed to know. Not now. We set off within 20 minutes, marching toward the crumbled district, marked 27C. The path was merciless. Buildings lay sideways like fallen dominoes. Rebar jutted from floors like bones. Every few meters, we passed chalk-marking search teams who had been through tagging where bodies had been recovered or where sounds had once been heard. It was like walking through a broken language. As we neared the last known coordinates, I called a halt. We scanned for movement, heat, life. Nothing. But something in my gut twisted. This was the place. We stepped into the husk of what had been a 2-story community centre. The walls were gone, the floor broken into 3 uneven slabs of concrete and mud. My team fanned out, careful, deliberate. Sergeant Patel used a thermal drone, flying it low. 2 heat signatures, Ma'am, he called. Faint, buried under southwest corner. I inhaled once. Sharp, clean. We dig. Using manual tools and tactical jacks, we pried through the debris. Inch by inch, like performing surgery with our bare hands. Dust filled our lungs, and every shift of weight sent tremors through what was left of the building. Still, no one stopped. They trusted me. I trusted myself. 45 minutes later, someone shouted. A hand. Pale, unmoving, but not yet cold. Pulse, the medic confirmed. 1 alive. Male. Late teens to early 20s. ID badge confirms Josh Turner. I knelt beside him. Blood matted his hair. His leg was trapped under a steel beam. Another aid worker, a woman in her 30s, lay unconscious beside him, breathing shallow but steady. Stabilize and extract, I ordered. I'll carry him out. A murmur passed through the squad, but no one questioned it. They cleared a path while I lifted him into my arms. He was lighter than I remembered. Older. His face had lost its boyishness, but I still saw it, the same tilt of his jaw when he used to concentrate the freckle under his left ear. He stirred as I hoisted him. "Mum," he whispered hoarsely, barely conscious. I want to go home." My throat clenched. I adjusted my grip. "We're taking you there." As we made our way out of the rubble, the horizon opened before us, broken, burning alive. And standing in the distance, just past the line of med tents and supply trucks, were 2 figures I hadn't expected to see. Michael. Diana. They must have fought tooth and nail to get this close. Dust-covered, red-eyed Diana clutched a crumpled scarf to her chest. Michael looked 10 years older. Their eyes locked onto me. And then, as I emerged from the haze carrying their son in my arms, something shifted. Diana's knees buckled. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Josh!" she choked. Josh groaned weakly but didn't open his eyes. I moved past them, focused on the med bay ahead. But then a voice stopped me. Not from a general, not from a mother, from something else entirely. General Diana said. Her voice broke on the word crumbling under its weight. You saved my son." The world seemed to fall silent for a breath. I turned slowly, met her eyes. Her lips trembled, her shoulders shook. Michael stood beside her, frozen. I said nothing, just nodded. This wasn't the moment for speeches. It wasn't vindication. It wasn't revenge. It was truth. The wind carried a haze of dust and charcoal as we pressed on the collapsed shelter, looming before us like a wounded beast. Steel girders twisted into the air cables, dangling like broken spines. My team and I moved with deliberate caution voices, mere whispers against the roar of the quake's afterlife. We crossed the threshold into darkness. The beam of my helmet torch cut through the smoke, revealing 2 silhouettes pinned beneath concrete rubble. One was the aid worker, her uniform a dull khaki, her face bruised but breathing steadily. The other was Josh limp, barely clinging to life dust, choking his throat. My training took over. Medics forward, hands gathered tools. I dropped to my knees, scanning his injuries, feeling the fragility of my half-brother in my arms. He stirred, eyelids fluttering, mouth opening. "Mom, I want to go home." His voice cracked through the silence. He didn't recognize me. Maybe he never would. But that didn't matter now. He was mine to save. I whispered to him carefully, lifting him from the debris. His arm slipped free. A steel beam scraped across my sleeve. Sirens of distant relief convoys and crackling radios urged us onward. They taught us resilience. And now, my chance to prove it wasn't for them. It was for him. As I rose, the world around me shifted into frame. Dust flew up around us as I carried Josh through the chaos. The aid worker was already on a stretcher, unresponsive but stable. I held Josh close, his head against my chest, his breath ragged, his fingers curling around my uniform. A shutter clicked. I couldn't see the photographer, but I sensed her presence a witness capturing this moment. A general decorated carrying a battered volunteer through the wreckage. Power stripped of pomp reduced to urgency. Humanity laid bare. We exited the rubble, moving into a clearing where emergency medics had set up triage. I passed the aid worker to a team member and stepped toward a waiting medic for Josh. His pulse fluttered under my fingertips. I stayed with him until they placed him onto the cot, careful and urgent. He closed his eyes as IV lines entered his vein. I stepped back. My team looked to me, 10 pairs of eyes trained in conflict and survival, now trained in witness. I gave the clearing gaze they'd learned to expect, steady, unflinching. He's in good hands. Prep evac. As we backed away, I couldn't help noticing how small he looked on that cot. The boy whose life I hadn't been allowed to touch. The boy Diana had held tighter than me. And here, I was the one holding him safe. The photographer stayed close camera, lowering as I passed. No flash. But the image would tell 1,000 stories, my story. Josh's story, Diana's, Michael's, the story of consequences and redemption. We pulled back into the haze. Smoke and silence settled behind us like an exhaled breath. I felt eyes on us soldiers, aid workers, displaced families, and in that moment I realized something profound. Leadership spoke louder when it touched vulnerability. Josh slipped into unconsciousness again. I placed a hand on his cot. "Go home," I whispered. "I've got you." Behind me, Captain Reed nudged me. "General," I exhaled dust. "Let him go. We have more ground to cover." He nodded. I turned back to him. All of it. The sun dipped lower, smearing reds and greys across the sky. The world here was still broken, but for one breath there was a moment of hope. A boy alive, a general, proving her worth, not in rank, but in action. I led my team onward into the heart of the collapse, into the missions that mattered because they saved lives, because they mattered most. When we returned to base camp hours later, Josh had been stabilized and prepped for medical evacuation. I stayed until he was loaded onto the transport, then finally let myself exhale. I wiped my face, touched the insignia pinned to my chest, and thought of Diana and Michael waiting somewhere not far off, waiting to see if relief arrived or reckoning. The collapse behind us was silent now, but inside me something shifted. The battle had moved from proving them wrong to saving the one they loved. The war was no longer with family dogma, but with mortality itself, and I was winning. The moment my boots touched solid ground outside the crumbling shelter, the weight of Josh in my arms reminded me this wasn't over. It had only just begun. Dust swirled like ghosts around us, thick enough to choke on as the remnants of the collapsed building groaned behind us. Josh was barely conscious, his breath-shallow face streaked with blood, and Ash, his arm dangling limply across my shoulder. But I didn't slow. The clearing was chaos. Relief workers shouted engineers, barked orders, and volunteers moved with frantic energy. But I heard none of it, just the beat of my own footsteps, the weight in my arms, the voice in my head, "Keep going. You don't get to fall now." From across the rescue zone beyond the barriers, I didn't know they were watching. Michael and Diana had made it through airport security, through embassy clearance, and now stood just outside the operation perimeter, having begged and clawed their way forward. A humanitarian liaison had taken pity on them after Diana collapsed in a fit of sobs at the checkpoint, pleading that her son was inside her only son. They had been told not to interfere, told to wait, but wait they couldn't. They stood now among other grieving families and volunteers, red-eyed and trembling. Diana clutched a pair of binoculars with both hands, her knuckles white as if willing them to show her something that could make this nightmare go away. And then she saw it. Across the distance, through the wreckage and noise, She saw a figure moving forward, cradling a limp body in military fatigues. It was Josh, his face smeared with blood, shirt torn, feet dragging, and the woman carrying him. She was strong, sharp, poised like a figure carved from the very stone their world had just shaken from beneath them. Her uniform bore no insignia they recognized, but her stance, her command was unmistakable. Diana's breath hitched. "Michael." She gasped, voice tight. "Look." Michael squinted, confused. "Who's that with him? Is he— Oh, God!" Diana's binoculars fell to her chest, suspended by their strap. Her hands rose to her mouth. "No, that's—" It hit her like a second quake. The realization cracked through her through years of denial, silence, and rehearsed superiority. Her knees buckled. She fell to the ground, hands in the dust, sobbing. "That's Evelyn. Michael, it's Evelyn." Michael didn't move. Couldn't. His hand trembled as he reached out, bracing Diana. The wind pulled at his jacket as he stood, frozen eyes locked on the sight in front of him, their daughter, the woman they'd erased, emerging from the ruins carrying the boy they'd once preferred in every way. A soldier stepped forward to intercept Evelyn. He saluted quickly, his voice cutting through the tension. "General, sector, secure. Med evac incoming in 4. The word echoed across the silence that had fallen. General. Not lieutenant, not officer, general. Diana's head jerked up again. "General," she repeated, like trying to taste the word aloud. She stared at Evelyn as if seeing a ghost, only this ghost had survived the fire. She dragged herself forward, crawling through the dirt. Her voice was small, cracked. "General, you saved my son." Evelyn didn't pause. She lowered Josh onto a stretcher as the med team arrived. She turned, gave one firm nod to her second in command. "Get him to evac. Go." Then she straightened. Face unreadable. Armor, not just physical, but emotional. She met Diana's eyes without flinching. Diana was weeping now uncontrollably, her voice trembling through her hands. "Evelyn, I didn't know. We didn't know." Michael stepped forward, eyes wide, with something that wasn't just regret, it was recognition. For the first time in his life, he looked at her and saw her. Not the teenager who defied him, but the leader who had just pulled his son from death. "I thought you were just in logistics," he said weakly. "We thought, Evelyn, we never imagined." Evelyn didn't reply, didn't scold, didn't forgive. She just looked at them. 2 figures reduced at last to silence, not by her rage, but by her presence. She didn't need to speak. Everything they hadn't believed now stood before them in flesh, blood, and dust. This wasn't the child they had once dismissed. This was the general who had fought wars and won battles they couldn't even name. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was truth laid bare in the sunlight and rubble. And as the med chopper roared above and her team moved into formation around her, Evelyn turned toward the perimeter. She didn't say goodbye, didn't offer comfort. She simply walked away back toward the front lines. Because sometimes the loudest vindication is silence. Within hours, that photograph circled the globe. A high-resolution still, General Evelyn Hart silhouetted against the dust storm, carrying Josh Turner like a fallen soldier. Online, it exploded. General Hart saves son of prominent American family blared the banner on a major news site. Social media erupted, trending hashtags like General Hart and Hero Sister dominated feeds. Thousands shared articles, retweeted the photo, and added their own spin. This is what bravery looks like. Family, shame no more. At home, Michael sat in the living room TV remote, cradled in one hand, the other drumming on the arm of his chair. In the next room, Diana's chair drew an unbroken line of light from the TV screen. The glow painted her face, shining each tear as it rolled. Michael didn't speak. The network's voiceover had introduced Evelyn as one of the most highly decorated Special Forces officers, mentioning nothing of their personal history. He lit a cigarette, held it a moment before exhaling. The trail of smoke moved slowly across the quiet room. Diana hadn't moved. Earlier, she'd staggered when the alert showed Evelyn's name. Now, she was rooted in place, hand trembling above the remote. She reached forward, lowered the volume. The anchor recapped the rescue, a daring entry into the collapse zone, the general's calm under pressure, the recovery of Josh Turner, and now his stable condition in the medevac. The camera held on her face, a stranger behind the screen. Her lips parted. She swallowed. My daughter, she whispered. No accusation, no apology, just recognition and acknowledgement, long overdue. Michael flicked the ash off his cigarette and finally said, voice low, "She did what we never believed she could." Diana's ears picked up the admission. She didn't respond right away, her eyes lost in the television's glow. Then she closed her eyes and leaned forward so the rest of the world fell away. Outside, sirens and chatter floated across the neighborhood families, tuning in, neighbors discussing the picture they'd seen the woman they'd never heard of until this moment. For the Hart family, those noises were a backdrop to an internal reckoning. The story expanded. Interviews emerged. Former teammates described Evelyn as unshakable in peril, a leader you follow into hell. One reporter quoted anonymous veterans, "She breaks the mold. She sets the standard." News talk shows debated what her rescue meant, not just for the family, but for American values, women in combat, the military career path, even family dynamics. Every platform dissected it, human interest pieces, op-eds by military analysts, morning show features on balancing duty with broken family ties. Diana stayed glued. She watched Evelyn speak in an on-site press conference, booking camera angles and microphones, answering questions about logistically rescuing aid workers, about emotions when she saw the blanket-covered stretcher, about why she led from the front. She heard Evelyn refer to Josh Turner as a fellow volunteer, always professional, never familial. Diana's lips tightened when that clicked. Evelyn had said it. The world believed she was no relation, and that was deliberate. The distance she maintained spoke loud. She saved him as a commander, not as a sister. Michael joined her on the couch. He didn't say anything. Upon seeing her hand shake again, he reached and held it. She didn't pull away. On the screen, a headline popped up. General Hart declines. Personal comment says, "She did my job." The quote rolled and echoed in the silent room. Diana's forehead creased. She swallowed again. She began, but paused at getting stuck inside the simplest sentence. She exhaled, eyes glistening. "A general." Michael closed his eyes. "Yes," he whispered. "Ah, general." They sat like that for minutes, letting every word unfold in the quiet. No shouting, no apologies, no rewriting their past. Just presence. Downstairs, their neighbours murmured with respect. The Hart crest on their door suddenly felt heavy, no longer a symbol of exclusion but of glory. Yet, at its heart, was a silent daughter they'd forgotten. In that stillness, something fundamental shifted in the Hart household. They'd watched with second-hand pride, unable until that moment to fully claim the accomplishment as theirs. Now, an image and a title gave them new language. She is remarkable. The broadcast ended. The TV clicked off. The room went dark except for city lights outside and a lingering glow of truth inside. Diana stood smoothing her clothes as if preparing to step into the light she'd never walked in. "Should we call her?" Her voice cracked. She didn't finish. Michael nodded. "Yes," he said, "but we wait." Because in that moment, they understood something. Evelyn already knew well, validation can't be demanded. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. But respect That must be earned just like she had done. They didn't speak again that night. But they didn't need to, because sometimes silence carries the weight of everything said and everything yet forgiven. The following morning, I roused early in the command tent, the low rumble of generators outside. My phone set to vibrate waited on the metal table. I didn't check the caller ID at first. I sat there buttoning my fatigue top, replaying the rescue in my mind, how Josh's body had gone limp, how the soldier's salute had sounded like a hammer strike, how Diana's kneeling cry had cracked everything open. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I tapped the screen. Mum. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I answered. General, her voice was thin, like someone whispering across a canyon. I waited. Part of me wanted her to break down completely. Another part braced for another insult, another attempt to blame. She didn't go there. Instead, I heard her exhale like she'd been holding her breath for far too long. I want to thank you. Something in the tent hummed unlikely as a confession heavier than any bomb. She stumbled. I know you won't forget, but thank you. That 4-word sentence pulled something taut inside me, a string stretched thin over years of neglect. I paused, controlled my breath. I did my duty, I replied, crisp, precise. I could hear the tremor in her voice. Please, can we see you? Just once? I'll come home, I said slowly. Just once, her voice cracked. Thank you, we said goodnight. The line went dead. I stared at the black screen, my heart thumping, less relief, more clarity. This wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. Not reconciliation, but recognition. And I needed it as much for me as for her. Later, I walked outside the tent in the sunlight. The base camp had quieted. My team at work, med-evac choppers ready. Then I saw Josh recovering in a makeshift clinic, tended by aid workers. His face was bruised, bandaged, but stable. He raised his gaze when we made eye contact. No recognition yet, but relief flickered. I closed my eyes. This was bigger than pride. It was about respect, earned in silence and grit, about redemption, defined not by their approval, but by what I'd done. That afternoon, I returned home. The house looked the same. White shutters, manicured lawn, the kind of perfection Diana had always maintained. I stepped out of the car, took a breath. No uniform this time, just jeans and a blue blouse. My rank tucked away. They needed to see Evelyn, not General Hart. Diana opened the door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face hollow. Evelyn, she began, voice soft. Thank you. I nodded once. For the first time, I stepped past the boundary she'd built. She didn't move. My father lingered behind her, silent as ever. I said, I've been in command. I've led missions, but none of that matters now. They nodded. I came because you asked, and I'm here once. The living room felt heavy. I looked at them, 2 faces I knew too well, one full of guilt and pride, the other blank with regret. You didn't celebrate me before. You hurt me when I needed you. But I don't need forgiveness. Diana's lip trembled. Michael closed his eyes, tears pooling. They didn't speak. I walked over and placed a folded envelope on the table. It was the rejection letter from years ago. Do something. Tell me this isn't a goodbye you regret. Diana swallowed hard, took the letter, read. We both watched in silence. Eventually she looked up. I erased you. I nodded. You did. Silence again. Then Diana said, It's not enough. She broke down in tears. My father stepped forward awkwardly, held out a stiff apology. I didn't accept it. I just looked at them, both eyes steady. Finally, I said, for what it's worth, I saved Josh. That's who I am. They bowed their heads. The apology hung unfinished in the air. I turned and left. No embrace, no tears. Just a slow exit toward my car. Back at base, I reported into my team. General, the family is contacted. I said, yes, they are. They paused. Are you okay? I let out a soft, dry laugh. Yeah, more than okay. I'm here. That evening, before the next mission briefing, I stood by the tent entrance, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the camp. An aide approached. Sir, I mean General. I turned. He handed a folder, new orders. I nodded. Duty calls. He hesitated. Ma'am. I smiled. Ma'am. He left. I watched him walk away, then closed my eyes. No forgiveness needed, no applause sought. Because tomorrow, I'll be where I belong. They meet in a quiet cafe. Late morning sunlight filters through half-drawn blinds. No cameras, no audience, just two women facing a lifetime of unspoken history. I slide into the seat across from Diana. She's nursing a cup of black coffee like it could steady her hands. Her eyes blink fast, unaccustomed to raw emotion. Evelyn, thank you, she begins, voice cracking already. I was wrong, she trails off. I reach into my satchel and place the worn, folded letter on the table between us, the one Michael wrote when I was 17. You're not welcome in this house until you come to your senses. Diana stiffens as her gaze drops. She glances at the faded ink, then at me. I shouldn't have done that. It was foolish, cruel. I thought I was protecting him, protecting the family. I study her face. She always wore control like armor. But now I see doubt, regret someone unraveling. My voice even measured. You didn't just doubt me. You erased me. I let those words hang. She stares at her coffee, tears welling. I erased you, she repeats. I locked you out of this family because I couldn't bear you challenging what I built. Josh was mine, everything I wanted to protect. You threatened that. You threatened Michael's pride, my image. I nod. It's the truth she's finally admitted. No denial now, no excuses. My father enters the cafe, hesitates at the door. I watch his eyes flick to the letter, then to Diana and me. He sets his wallet and phone on the table. Evelyn, he begins, voice soft and unsteady. I never meant to break you. He reaches for the letter. Diana's shoulders shake. I don't move to stop him. He whispers I was wrong. He closes his eyes, shame and sorrow etched across his face. Diana's first real tears fall, and her voice lowers to a whisper. I'm sorry. I have been so afraid that you would upstage everything, that you would expose the family's flaws. I never saw you, that there it is naked and true. And in this quiet moment, something shifts between us. I stay calm. I don't soften or retreat, but I do lean in, eyes locking with hers. You didn't erase a soldier. You erased a daughter. She gasps, tears falling faster. I didn't see you as my daughter. That wound is laid bare. I breathe, gathering years of hurt, betrayal, rejection, and now the possibility of closure. Not reconciliation yet, but acknowledgement. I pick up the letter and fold it slowly, deliberately. Maybe I can't give you back your vision of who I should be, and maybe I don't want it, my voice tight. But I want you to understand who I've become on my own. No medals, no ranks. I touch my chest where a badge once sat. Just me. Silence. They both look at me now as the one who chose her own path, with consequences I feel ready to own. Diana reaches forward, but her hand trembles. She stops midway. She's not asking for forgiveness. She's asking for recognition. I sit back. I'm not offering a hug. I'm offering truth. We both deserve that. She nods. My father closes his eyes again, grief and relief intermingling on his face. We don't need to speak again that day. We've spoken everything through that letter, through that stare, through the soft crackle of a broken family shifting towards something new. I stand to leave. Diana and my father both rise. They don't reach for me. I don't expect it. I pause at the door, look back with steady eyes. This I gesture at the cafe at them both. This is not trust regained. It's a reckoning, and I'll accept it for what it is. Then I turn and walk away, quietly, firmly unbroken. The next morning dawned crisp, the sky brushed in soft hues of lavender and gold. The invitation to speak at the academy had arrived weeks ago, tucked neatly into my inbox. Polite, formal, and yet personal. I hadn't responded immediately. Part of me still flinched at stages at spotlights. But this wasn't about proving anything anymore. This was about being seen not by those who had once doubted, but by those still finding their footing. I stepped onto the academy grounds in full dress uniform. A sea of cadets rose in synchronized salute, their posture crisp, their eyes filled with something I recognized: hunger for truth, for courage, for something unspoken but burning. I spoke not from a podium, but from the center of the training yard. No screens, no presentation slides, just my voice steady and clear. You'll be told you don't belong, I said. You'll be tested in ways no manual prepares you for. And sometimes you'll win battles no one claps for. But remember, this peace isn't always the end of the war. Sometimes it's surviving through it. They were silent, listening, not just hearing, but really listening. A hand shot up, a young woman with cropped hair not older than 20. Her voice held more sincerity than fear. "Mom, how did you make it through?" I let the silent stretch, allowed the question to settle into the bones of the morning. Then I said simply, I stopped needing applause. I started seeking peace. No one clapped, and I didn't need them to. Afterward, I slipped away from the yard, the applause rising faintly behind me as the ceremony moved on. I didn't linger. I had other places to be, not destinations, just moments I hadn't allowed myself before. Like this one, I wandered the coastline not far from the base boots in one-hand jacket, folded over my other arm. The wind was sharp, but clean. Honest, the kind of air that reminds you how small and strong you are all at once. As I walked, a child, a boy of maybe 8, ran up his shoes, slapping the sand cheeks red with wind. He skidded to a hole a few feet away, eyes wide staring at the medals on my chest. "Were you a real general?" he asked, breathless. I crouched down, slowly looked him straight in the eye. "Still am I," said, and smiled. He grinned and ran off, his laughter carried by the wind. I stood and looked out over the waves, hands in pockets, now no rank, no title, just breath, just life, not for applause, but for peace. And if you're out there, someone who has been cast aside, misunderstood, or told your dreams were too heavy for your shoulders, I want you to hear this. You are not invisible, not to the world, and certainly not to yourself. We all carry scars that don't show up in photographs. Some of us were erased quietly, not by strangers, but by the people we called family. Some of us had to leave the table just to find our own voice. But healing doesn't ask for permission. It starts in small, defiant acts, choosing yourself even when no one else does, building a life brick by brick out of pain, purpose, and patience. In today's world, more and more people are learning to reclaim their narratives. Some find therapy, others journal or run or paint or speak their truth online. Some sit in silence until the noise fades. And many, just like Evelyn, lead quietly without needing applause. If you're one of them, I hope this story reminded you that you're not alone, and that your path, no matter how bruised, is still worthy of honor. And if this story stirred something in you, if it helped you feel seen or gave you a moment of stillness in the chaos, consider subscribing. There are more stories coming, real ones, quiet ones, the kind that remind us you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't need applause to be whole. You just need truth and peace.